Hey folks, this is Rhykker, and if you're looking to decide what class and build to play for Last Epoch when it launches this week, then you'll want to watch this video. I spoke with the Last Epoch experts over at maxroll.gg. This is a think tank of some of the most brilliant theory crafters and experienced blasters who know the game in and out, since it's been in early access for a couple of years. And we came up with a list of the 10 best builds in the game. But before we dive in, we need to explain Last Epoch's class system. There are 5 base classes, and each of these has 3 masteries. Masteries are specialty classes that you select while playing through the campaign, somewhere around level 16. The Mage class is your typical elemental spellcaster. His masteries include the Sorcerer, who focuses on long-range magic. The Spellblade, a close-range mage that will imbue his sword with magic. And then the Runemaster, which is a really unique class that revolves around a combo mechanic where casting different spells in different orders can result in different effects. I got a full video about the Runemaster right here. The Rogue class is your typical dexterity archetype, bows, daggers, spears. The Bladedancer mastery is a high mobility melee class. The Marksman is the bow wielder, and the newest mastery in the game, the Falconer, lays traps and has a loyal falcon at her side that is an important part of her kit. The Sentinel is your typical heavy armor, sword and board type melee class. Its masteries include the Paladin, a holy warrior who can heal and buff allies, the Void Knight, who uses the dark powers of the Void instead, and the Forge Guard, who summons and buffs animated weapons and armor as minions. Then you have the Acolyte, a spellcaster that uses all that evil forbidden magic. Masteries include the Necromancer, who raises armies of the dead, the Lich, who focuses on becoming a superpowered undead herself, and the Warlock, a new mastery that focuses on cursing enemies. Then lastly, we have the Primalist, a warrior that's in touch with nature. His masteries include the Shaman, who focuses on magical nature totems and spells, the Druid, who focuses on shapeshifting, and the Beastmaster, who focuses on summoning nature beasts. Alright, we're ready for our top 10 builds. These are builds you're aiming for endgame, starting at level 70 through level 100. In our next video, we'll talk about leveling builds, the build you want to use before you swap to your endgame build. But you want to know what your destination is before you hit the road. So our top 10 builds here are builds that will perform the best on average across all the game's endgame content. If you want to see where each build lands for things like speed farming, bossing, and more, Maxroll has tier lists for all these separate activities. And because we wanted to ensure that each of the 5 base classes got some representation here, we're actually going to start with 2 honorable mentions. Our first build will be the only Sentinel build on this list. It's the Nova Hammer's Paladin, which is reminiscent of a classic D2 Hammerdin. And we got Volka here from Maxroll. He wrote the guide on this build to tell us about it.
This is actually one of my most played builds by far, my favorite one in the game. Just crazy clear on this build. As you can see, it's full screen AoE with the hammers, so they can actually even off screen and hit enemies from very far away. It's just great for clearing maps and really easy to play. Basically one button build, just using some extra skills for buffs. And yeah, just amazing clearing. Definitely the one weakness of this build is the single target damage. So bossing is gonna be, it's not gonna be bad if you have gear, but it's never gonna be like amazing or mind blowing. So it's gonna be like a kind of like a 5 out of 10 or 6 out of 10 on bossing. So that's the one and kind of like only actual drawback of the build.
Our second honorable mention will be the Thorns Totem Shaman. And we got Bina from Maxroll to tell us about this build.
Thorn Totem is actually one of my favorite builds in the entire game. It's played as a Shaman. This is just an excellent league starter that does not require much gear to get started, and you can unlock Thorn Totem at level 4. So it is actually one of these builds where you don't have to play another build to level up and have a smooth experience in the campaign and the early monos. You can start playing it as soon as level 4, and around level like 25 to 30, you unlock your Spriggan form, which is going to be your main form that you're going to use, and you're going to summon healing totems, which in turn, they will use the Thorn Totem tree, so they will shoot thorns, heal you, grab aggro, you can have them give you haste, so you get multiple different buffs. And it's like just a one button playstyle where you just cast your healing totems. It kills everything in the vicinity, and it's really easy to play. So easy to play, high damage, very safe playstyle because you can cast them at range. You have no mana issue because as you summon them, there is a node in the skill tree that actually lets you gain rage back when they unsummoned. And since you have a totem limit, you gain rage back as you cast them. So it's a self-sustaining build that just excels in the ease of playing it. It does have a couple of downsides though. So you have no mobility skill when you're in Spriggan form. Another con that I could say would be because your healing is tied to your healing totems, it is not instantaneous healing and sustain, like a typical leech build, for example. Your healing totems work in a way that they will shoot 3 Thorns, and then they will heal you with their ability, but it is not instantaneous.
Alright, moving into our top 10 list now. The next 5 builds we cover are actually very similar in power. These aren't ranked from worst to best. And the first we'll talk about is the Bleed Warlock, and we have the max roll Last Epoch team lead here, Lizard, to tell us about it.
This is a bit of a fantasy people have been waiting for. This build just causes absolute chaos. It drops Chthonic Fissure on the ground, which is this very big fissure that releases spirits and chaos bolts, and the chaos bolts proc other skills, and those skills proc other skills, and it's like this loop inception cast on hit fantasy that I think people are gonna love. And it makes enemies bleed to death, let's just say that. The build has amazing AoE. The single target is not crazy, but it's really good. And I would say, if I had to say something bad, it would be that the mana management, until you get accustomed to how the mana on Curse works and how Chaos Bolt generates mana and so on, can be a bit tricky. But, you know, the full guide that we have on Maxroll explains how to manage that properly. But other than that, you know, the build is pretty straightforward. It's a bit more click intensive than some of the other Warlock builds, but I think the payout is incredible. And the most obvious thing of how powerful this thing gets is that it has great synergy with low life because of how Chaos Bolts can scale from cold resistance. So you can, you know, you can scale it from Frostbite Shackles, which are the unique gloves that give you ward retention for cold resistance, and it can get pretty crazy when it comes to how much ward this build can generate. On my character that I've been testing, I have over 20,000.
Next up, we got another Warlock build, the Torment Warlock, and we're going back to Volca for this one.
This Warlock uses a Chthonic Fissure to proc Torment. So basically, Torment is a curse only available on the Chthonic Fissure, and does a lot of necrotic damage over time. Then you can use other necrotic dot skills to kind of like supplement the damage. So we're using Wandering Spirits here, and then Profane Veiling to get even more damage out of it. It really is like a combo build using a lot of like different damage sources. It's completely necrotic damage. So there's like a lot of curses we're using. So up to like 5 or 6 curses you can have, which then give you more damage per curse, and just a lot of synergy with curses in general. So you can have like more armor per curse, more like less damage taken per curse. Then you can use your Profane Veil to basically be immune to all damage. So you're gonna dodge every hit, and you even get some insane damage buffs while using it. So really strong build. There's not really many like cons of this build. It's really fast, it's really good damage and all that stuff. It's a little bit less powerful in like bossing, but you can make it scale really hard, because basically what you do on this build, you stack a lot of necrotic resistance, which gives you more damage and also tankiness. So if you have a gear, you can do like insane bossing damage as well.
Our next build is the Plasma Orb Runemaster, and we're going back to Bina.
The Plasma Orb Runemaster uses Runic Invocation to combine Lightning, Fire, and Lightning and cast Plasma Orbs that orbit around you. These orbs will shock enemies and zap enemies that are near them, so there's 2 portions of damage to this skill. The actual ball is fire damage, and the zaps of lightnings are lightning damage. What we're trying to achieve here is as much lightning damage as possible. This is a super active build with lots of button presses. We are manually casting Runic Invocation. It is a super good corruption, high corruption farming build, and a fast casting build that is gonna always keep you on your toes, and it's a very engaging playstyle. Also, because this is a Rune Master, you get access to the very strong Cold Fire Cold Invocation, Ruin Frostguard, which gives you a ton of ward and damage reduction. So some of the downsides of this build, because it needs to have at least one downside, right? Well, it is pretty heavy on mana management. So you will need to find an affix on your helm, which gives you a chance to gain 20 mana back when you directly cast Rune Bolt to be able to sustain properly the mana on this build. If not, you might find yourself casting a couple more Rune Bolts instead of just casting Plasma Orbs, right? And one other cons I could say about this build is that as good as it is and it is an engaging gameplay, it is quite complex button management. So you need to always have the right rotation. It is rotation based. If you mess up your keystrokes, you might not cast Plasma Orb, you'll cast another invocation. So it is very susceptible to user error.
Next up, we have two similar builds, the Shadow Daggers Falconer and the Shadow Daggers Bladedancer. While they both use Shadow Daggers, there are some key differences in how these builds play, and Maxwell's McFluffin will tell us about them.
So the Shadow Daggers Falconer is a really cool build that is kind of a different style. It's very different stylistically than anything in the game right now, thanks to the Falcon. It does have a lot of similarities to the other Shadow Dagger build that we're going to talk about, but what really sets it apart, the Falcon's actually going to pick up your character and drop you wherever you sort of choose to go, and when he does, he's going to drop Umbral Blades that also create Shadow Daggers, which will explode all over the place. It just creates a really cool visual effect that's also a lot of damage and can clear out a very large part of the screen all at once. And it can do this very quickly with a really well-made build with good gear. It can do this less than every second, so you can really truly fly all over the map, just taking out enemies in very quick succession, making it one of the fastest builds in the game. There's no kind of content that it struggles with. It's good at literally everything: tier 4 dungeons, speed farming, corruption pushing, you name it. And it's also relatively tanky. It's not an easy build to kill, especially once you get the right gear or go with some of the more tanky setups. There's always a way you can make this build very tanky so that you're able to survive the content you're doing. As far as the cons go, there's some interesting mechanics with the Falcon that can make it a little bit of a negative, since you have to kind of rely on the Falcon to help you get your cooldown so that you can do the aerial assault, the flight, a lot more often. He has his own personality, and sometimes maybe he doesn't listen quite as much as you want, but for the most part he's really good. But you're a little bit minion reliant as far as whether or not he's going to hit enemies at any given time. So that's a bit of a con, not a big one. There is a bit of mana management, especially if you don't have a lot of gear yet, if you don't have minus mana cost stuff. You are very vulnerable when you're not moving because you have multiple damage reduction bonuses when you're moving, and so you have to be careful to choose when you're going to stop and pick up items or maybe use your net ability. The Bladedancer version has been out for a lot longer, and it's a very popular build. These builds do feel kind of similar in how fast they are, but how they get there is entirely different. You're going to be moving around with shift very quickly and going at lightning speed, 130, 150% move speed, and you're actually going to be sort of assassinating enemies as you go. You're going to be using your synchronized strike ability to jump into enemies and then shift out, and when you do that, you're going to be causing a ton of Umbral Blaze explosions and other explosions that are all going to cause Shadow Daggers, which are going to do this very large amount of damage. And you can do this very quickly, similar to the other build where you had like less than 1 second cooldown. This one's a little bit longer, but not much longer. It does have some weaknesses. There's some mana management in them. It's vulnerable when not moving, although not quite as vulnerable as the other build. But it doesn't have to worry about the minion. Instead, it can kind of feel out of control a little bit more than the other one because you're jumping, dashing in, jumping out, dashing in, jumping out so much. You can kind of feel like it's a little bit hard to manage with a lot of attacks that are going off, especially the telegraphed ones. Once you get used to it, it's not a problem, but for players who are just picking it up, they might find that they're feeling just a bit more out of control than some of the other builds.
The next two builds we'll talk about are a little more powerful than the ones we just discussed. We've got the Wraith Necromancer, and we're going back to Lizard to tell us about this one.
So the Wraith Necromancer at this point is an absolute classic of Last Epoch, the turret minion playstyle that a lot of people love. This build remains strong, still crazy for 1.0. It's a very active playstyle too, even though it's just minion playstyles. But the amount of projectiles, the amount of single target, the amount of scaling potential through uniques of this build is just absolute crazy. The mana is absolutely free thanks to Drain Life. Their damage is amazing. It's a great starter, and as long as you get the idols for raids, you can just destroy the game completely. This has been considered one of the strongest builds for a long time, you know, excluding some of the stuff that we have before 1.0, like the zombie stuff and like the Runemaster stuff. But other than that, I think this still remains probably the best minion build in the game, aside from our new feathered friend. I would say that if I had to say what he's not the best, it's like he's not the fastest. Like you cannot compare it to a Bladedancer or to something like that. But he's not slow by any means, especially once you get going and you get used to the rotation of drain life, etc. And he's not the tankiest either, but he's definitely, when it comes to clear, corruption pushing, and just like single target, guy's a beast.
Next, we got the Hydrahedron Runemaster. Lizard, tell us about this one.
Well, the Hydrahedron Runemaster, one of the highlights of Runemaster. There's a lot of builds for this class, but this one is kind of like a fan favorite just because it reminds of the whole Hydras from other games, right? Horse is a bit less beasty, it's more of like a polygon, but it's still really powerful. This build is really amazing. It's crazy fast because all you do is dash. You can pretty much automate the entire process of just like summoning the Hydras. And if I had to give this build a weakness, would be that generating fire runes at the right rate when you're channeling Flame Dash can be a bit tricky depending on how your server ticks. So a lot of people sometimes complain about this, so just be aware that I don't find it to be a problem, but some people do.
And the last 3 builds on our list will be the best builds in the game in pretty much every single situation. We'll start with the best bow build in the game, the Blast Rain Marksman, and go back to Volka.
Right, so this is indeed one of the best bow builds, maybe even the best. It just has amazing clear, amazing DPS, amazing speed. It is just insane in every way. The only a little bit less insane thing about this build is the tankiness, but you can actually use like a really crazy free setup to be actually super tanky, but you need to have a lot of gear for it. So there is even a way to get tanky on it. It doesn't really have any weaknesses, to be honest, and you can scale it extremely high with gear, so it really scales well with uniques and legendaries. So how this build actually works, we're using Explosive Trap as a bow skill, so it's normally a throwing attack, so basically like a trap you just throw, but we instead convert it into bow, and then it procs a lot of detonating arrows, so the gameplay is just very like flashy and just crazy, basically.
Our last 2 builds are both Falconer builds, similar but with some key differences, the Explosive Ballista Falconer and then the Ballista Falconer. Bina, get us started with the Explosive Ballista Falconer.
This should prove to be an incredible build. It's going to use Ballista as an explosive Ballista for its main damage, and there's a very specific node in Ballista which makes it scale its damage and its AoE with dexterity, and the value on that node is extremely high. So how this works, you're gonna scale dexterity, you're gonna scale it so high that you have screen-wide AoE and an insane amount of damage, and you are going to proc these Ballistas with Explosive Trap. There's a node in Explosive Trap that lets you proc Ballistas with a 20% chance to do so. So you're gonna get your Explosive Trap down to 0 mana cost. You're going to use a passive that lets you gain mana when you hit an enemy with a 0 mana cost skill. And so Explosive Trap will become a mana generator, proccing Ballistas for screen-wide AoE and an insane clear speed, basically, because you're gonna have insane damage. What are the cons of this build? Well, you need a lot of minus throwing attack mana cost to make it cost 0 mana. So that is going to be one requirement, which you can achieve with Exalted Rings or with Bow's Anarchy Staff. One other con for this build would be that it will probably have low sustain on single target, since your main source of sustain will come from the Falconer passive Finesse Them, which will give you health gain on crit. So with big AoE, you'll hit a lot of monsters that will heal you a lot, but against single target, that won't be as effective.
All right, now tell us about the Ballista Falconer.
So the Ballista Falconer is your actual classic turret playstyle Ballista. You lay down your Ballistas, they shoot their bolts at enemies at range, and with the addition of experimental affixes in 0.9, well, you will now be able to move your Ballistas around with you when you use your traversal skill, which is going to be Aerial Assault. Aerial Assault will also give you nice buffs for your Ballistas, since with the introduction of this skill, you get access to a node which will give you 2% more damage per intelligence. So you will now want to scale intelligence on a rogue to buff your Ballistas by giving them more damage. So classic Ballista playstyle, excellent mobility, very fast clear speed, and I will have great damage scaling with that node as well. One little problem though, it costs a lot of mana. Ballistas cost 44 mana by default. You can reduce this by 50% in its skill tree, so you're still up to 22 mana per Ballista. You'll need to stack mana regen on gear. You will have to manage your mana in some ways and not cast Ballista too often unless you have like really great mana regen. So there's a bit of management there to have a good time by playing this build. That being said, when you do reach that point where your mana feels good when you cast your Ballistas, it's basically a walk in the park, right? So you just cast your Ballistas, you aerial assault around, they all follow you, and you make full use of all of their duration.
Alright, that wraps up our top 10 list. As a reminder, Maxroll has written guides for all of these builds, and each of the experts we spoke to today will be streaming Last Epoch, so go follow them on Twitch and ask them any questions you may have about the game or their guides, and stay tuned for our next video on leveling builds.